I'd like to welcome everybody to the July school board meeting. Call the roll, Mr. Bassett, please.
Mr. Jewell?
Present.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Here.
Mr. Dunkman?
Here.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Here.
And Mr. Moore?
Here.
I'd like for everybody to stand and say the pledges to the flag. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
At this time, we set aside for visitors' comments. Do we have any visitors that come up here? State your name and address.
Well, I don't want to stand up there and say, I don't want to say anything down, but if I come back, I'm probably sure going to be saying something. There, that's all I have to say.
Anyone else? At this time, we're going to go into executive meeting. I need a motion.
So moved.
Second.
First by Mr. Duncan, second by Mrs. McIntosh for an executive session for the purpose of personnel.
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
And Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Time in is 6:02.
At this time, we're going to turn it over to Mr. Vassar for the treasurer report.
Okay, out of executive session at 6:46 and back to the regular part of the meeting. Before we do my action items, I opened my mail before I came to the meeting, Capitol Conference. That is November 10, 11, and 12. That's Sunday through Tuesday. So start looking at your calendars, and we'll talk about by next board meeting, by the August board meeting. Hopefully you guys will have a firm up on what we want to do. So just wanted to bring that up. November 10, 11, and 12 is the Capitol Conference in Columbus. And by next board meeting, we'll be looking for what we want to do as a group. Okay, my action items. I need approval for the minutes from the last regularly scheduled board meeting, which was June the 24th.
I need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mr. Dunkman, need a second. By Mr. Moore. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
And Mrs. McIntosh.
Yes.
Next is financial report, which was part of your packet. Year end, June 30. We ended very well. Won't get too much into the specifics, but yeah, we did end very well for the year to get us hopefully in a good position to move into a new building here in another year, and feel comfortable with our ups and downs and differences and ebbs and flows of how we're going to be in a new building, since we're going to be running air conditioning every day or heat every day, depending on what the weather is going to be. Air conditioning yesterday and maybe heat on a day like today. Who knows, to keep that temperature the same. So I need approval for the financial report.
Need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Lanehart,
Second.
by Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lanehart,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
and Mr. Dunkman.
Yes.
That's my short report for the month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
At this time, I'll turn it over to Mr. Hook for our superintendent's report.
Thank you, Mr. Jewell, members of the board. Just a quick update on construction. We continue to really power through out there. I'm very impressed with the rate at which they're moving. The high school area is now up to the rafter level, so that's exciting. The elementary has been prepped for the second floor pour, which if weather cooperates will be done this week. So then the second floor of the elementary, the large elementary area will be done. They're already beginning to put studs in on the first floor of the high school. So it's starting to take shape. Moved in gas lines and some other things like that. So it is moving at a rapid pace, and I'm very, very pleased with what we're doing. Do want to get you out for a tour. We got rained out tonight, obviously, and so just I'll try to watch the weather here and see if we can get a better prediction, and hopefully we can get you back out there when it's a little bit more less muddy and stuff. So, okay.
So everything is on time and?
Yep.
Okay, because there is a rumor that I just heard the other day from somebody saying that we were 3 months behind. So I wanted to clarify that on camera, we are on time.
I don't have anything for that.
The last cement
You
pour was
know,
actually poured a day early.
Yes, we're actually
I
well
know
ahead.
it. I know it was on time. I just want to make sure it's, so
It is.
they know.
Yeah, and it's big enough too, trust me. Moving right along. Action items that we have going into general business. Do want to make mention, need approval for the Atrium Medical Center Premier Health. It's for our athletic services, athletic training services. We've been in this, we've been with them for quite a while. Little caveat, this one is a 10-year deal with them. They provide all of our training services, just as in the past. The caveat is they are going to roll all of their, typically they give us a stipend, you know, to have that, their name here and associated with the school. They are going to give us a one-time $200,000 donation to start we would like to use that as start the athletic kind of stadium
Track and stuff.
upgrade. So we'll start a campaign, a private campaign in the fall when people can actually see the bricks up there and things moving. And so we have $200,000 worth of seed money to start that process. So pretty exciting. And, I think we got a great trainer and Nick Berger. And so we get to keep him that way too. So with that, I need approval for the new Atrium Premier Health contract.
Need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mr. Dunkman,
Second.
second by Mrs. Lanehart. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
And Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Item number 2, under certified resignations, need approval to accept Mr. Schooler's resignation.
Need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Lanehart,
Second?
by Mr. Moore. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
And Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Item number 3, under certified employment, need approval for A, B, and C listed.
So moved.
First by Mrs. Lanehart,
Second.
second by Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Item 4, under classified employment, need approval for A and B listed.
Need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mr. Dunkman,
Second?
by Mr. Moore. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Item number 5, under supplemental employments, need approval for items A through Z.
I need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mr. Moore,
Second.
by Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Moore,
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mr. Jewell,
Yes.
Mr. Dunkman,
No.
and Mrs. Lanehart.
Yes.
Item number 5, AA, need approval for the listing for wrestling coach.
I need a motion.
So moved.
First by Mr. Moore. I need a second.
I second.
By Mrs. McIntosh. Call the roll, please.
Mr. Moore,
No.
Mrs. McIntosh,
Yes.
Mr. Dunkman,
Abstain?
Mrs. Lanehart,
No.
Mr. Jewell.
Yes.
So just a reminder to the board that in order to be a no, it would have to be 4 no votes to 1 yes vote. So a 2-2-1 vote is motion carries.
Thank you.
That concludes my report.
Okay, do we have anything legislative report?
Looks like the governor finally signed the budget that they approved last month, so that's good news. But the bad news is now that they're focusing a lot of their attention on graduation requirements and all of those things. So that rigmarole is going to hopefully not impact our 2020 class, but definitely going to see some changes by our 2021 class.
Anything CTC?
We did not have a meeting in July because we always have a work session in June that takes care of that July meeting. So we won't meet till August.
Do we have any old business? Any new business? Then we need to go into executive for evaluation of superintendent and the treasurer. I need a motion.
So
Pick which one you
I'm
want.
gonna go Lanehart with the first and Mr. Moore with the second.
thank you.
Perfect.
Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Lanehart?
Yes.
Mr. Moore?
Yes.
Mrs. McIntosh?
Yes.
Mr. Dunkman?
Yes.
And Mr. Jewell?
Yes.
Thank you.
Time in for evaluation is 6:58.